Racial justice has always created conflict in this country, since the first enslaved people were brought here from Africa in 1619. In the 1960s, famous leaders rose to push for desegregation,
live out the true meaning of its creed,
equality,
I was taught in American history books, but Africa had no history,
and justice.
Who taught you to hate being what God gave you?
But it didn't stop there. Decades apart, the same scenes are still taking place.
Take your knee off our necks!
No justice! No peace!
Anyone else had barged into her apartment and shot and killed her, they would have been charged.
The fight for racial justice for all continues.
Could say a bad thing about me, I cannot talk back to them.
Tell them that just because someone's color of skin is different than yours does not make them a different person.
Even in 2021.
Walking down the street and have somebody drive by and call you the N-word.
The more you see Floyd fade away.
Someday we are going to have enough representation of the Latinas.
It really made me think about whether or not it was correct for me to enjoy the culture that I was born into.
From the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University, this is Focus Racial Justice. Here's Bernice Degwa and Nicole Zarilla.
Welcome to Focus Racial Justice. I'm Nicole Zarilla.
And I'm Bernice Degwa. Now for the past 4 months, our team has been working diligently to produce stories about racial justice.
And these stories are compelling stories, powerful stories, definitely stories that make you feel something. These are about real people, real events that affects all of us.
Now, I hope you learn as much as we did doing this. Here's some stories coming up.
First, we'll meet a man who spent 39 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. How did he finally win his freedom?
I didn't do it, and I'm never going to acknowledge or admit that I did.
Then, we'll go inside the history textbooks your kids use and see why many of them don't tell America's full story.
My teacher gave me a 0 and yelled at me, telling me that it's nonsense that I don't know where I'm from.
And throughout the hour, we'll explore the quest for racial justice through the stories of generations of diverse Americans whom we've gathered for this broadcast.
Racism against Asian Americans exists since the birth of this country.
We begin today with a pressing issue: people of color reluctant to get the COVID vaccine. Joining me now is reporter Ryan Breda.
That's correct, Bernice, and there are many reasons for that skepticism. A nurse starts off by telling us why. Melody Randall is a nurse practitioner and a professor at Wilmington University. Randall actively advocates for people of color to take the COVID vaccine as she believes it will help the Black community.
I do support the vaccination. I think it's very legitimate for people to have fears and concerns, and I think those feelings are very valid. I too had those feelings of concern prior to getting the vaccination. But I did get the vaccination. I'm very happy that I got the vaccination. I'm fully vaccinated.
The vaccination rate of Black New Jersey residents is only a fraction of white residents in the state. The death rate among Black Americans is double that of white and Asian Americans.
The fact that there is a double death rate amongst minority people with COVID is multifactorial. It's just the living space, the economic disadvantage that some of them may face.
And then there's a history of medical mistreatment towards Black Americans. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, conducted from the 1930s until the 1970s, is the most notable example. Scientists intentionally injected men with syphilis and lied to those involved.
When you, as a minority person, has experienced mistrust in the medical field in the past, you tend to really carry that over. That's not easily forgotten.
Montclair State University alumni Rebecca Eugene is one of the people of color who does not trust the vaccine.
With everything that happened with the Tuskegee Project, and history does repeat itself. And we've seen how Black people are always disproportionately affected in this system that America has built, whether that's from Black men being killed in the streets by police officers or the mortality rate of Black women when they're giving birth in the hospitals.
Montclair State University professor Courtney Reinisch says she's doing her part to end the disparities by vaccinating those in Essex County through the School of Nursing.
I am of a Latino background, so I do believe it is important that I do my part to speak.
Reinisch is hopeful that if leaders and communities of people of color speak up, then the trust level will increase.
I think we need more leaders stepping up and showing their faces. So if it's in a church, the church leader, the pastor speaking up, rolling up their sleeve, we connect with people that we know. So we need more of those faces.
There's still a lot of work to be done with the COVID disparities among Black Americans, but with education and people of color speaking up about the vaccination, then we might start to see some progress. From Montclair News Lab, I'm Ryan Breda.
Thank you, Ryan. The country has faced a rise in discrimination and violence against Asian Americans, most recently in Atlanta and a number of other attacks. I recently sat down with Jennifer Tran, a student at Montclair State and a leader of her sorority's diversity efforts. I asked her, how have Asian Americans been discriminated against due to the pandemic?
I mean, it had to have started like literally this time last year when our former president, Trump, was in office. Trump was saying stuff like Kung flu virus or like the Chinese virus. So that instantly put like a target on like everyone's back, just because not a lot of people are educated enough to know that there's more than just Chinese. There's Korean, there's Vietnamese. There's so many other like branches that fall under Asians that not a lot of people are educated or well informed about. So that basically puts a target on my back too, in a sense. It's a very scary like disease and virus that's going on. But there's been a lot of incidents, especially with elders being pushed around and harassed around the street. And it really just like breaks my heart
seeing what's going on in the news and obviously fearing for your own family and your own safety. Have you even dealt with anything or had someone say something passive aggressive to you?
I would always just bury them and suppress them down. I'm actually working on it. I've actually been seeing a therapist since like November, just to like talk and let things out and just unravel these experiences that I've just buried deep down. I've had a lot of like terrible and violent nightmares that would literally keep me up all night after I wake up from them. I do have like a lot of anxiety, especially just being a woman in general. So I'm always trying to prepare for like the absolute worst situation that could happen.
Continuing our conversation on racism directed at Asian Americans, our reporter Grace Rowland brings us our first generation segment.
Throughout the hour, I'll be speaking with 3 generations of Americans of diverse backgrounds on how they've experienced racism throughout their lives. First, 3 generations of Vietnamese descent, all unrelated.
Nhan Ha. Born in 1947, she fled South Vietnamese communism and migrated to America in 1975. Van Lee. Born in 1962, he's currently a real estate agent who also fled South Vietnamese communism in 1975. Joseph Nguyen, an American college student born in 1999.
Discrimination against Asian Americans didn't begin when the pandemic did. It's been going on for generations.
Racism, discrimination exists in the United States for a long time. That hate about the COVID pandemic, that discrimination get incited because the former president.
Major attacks, violence against Asian Americans because of COVID, but racism against Asian Americans exists since the birth of this country. Name calling against Asian is pretty common. Getting picked on is not something new. When we came here, we had no choice but to make believe like the racism doesn't exist. And me being the first generation, my parents kind of instilled those thoughts in me just so that we could have the courage to move forward. I have two sons. We don't talk about it. And maybe because of that's what I learned, although deep down inside of me, I think I should talk about it.
Obviously people that my descendants, my kids, and their kids after them are going to have to face stuff like this. It's not going to be, a snap and it's going to vanish. I really wish that no person would be afraid to go out because of their race.
Vietnamese culture, we are very proud of our names. My name actually is Nhan, and the name bird. So I was proudly told my college, oh, this is my name Bird. That person gave me a nickname called Bird Friend. At first, I did not understand what Bird Friend means. Then I came home and asked my children. So I was so upset.
When I was about 16, I was walking down the street. There were two, teenagers, and they wanted to take my gold chain. They were pretty much gather up and gang up. But, living in the urban area, you tend to build this shield of making believe. There was a stereotype that Asian people know Kung Fu and karate and all that stuff. So I survived built on the stereotypes about Asians. I don't know anything about karate. I don't know anything about, our martial arts, but, I fought back.
Well, if I were to bring in food for lunch, that was culturally different from the food that was eaten by a majority of the people, who would be like, oh, what is that? Oh, is that gross? It looks like poop, or it smells bad, or stuff like that. It really made me think about whether or not it was correct for me to enjoy the culture that I was born into.
My children, they went to the shopping mall. 3 little kids there, call them ching chong, something like that. So my son said, that is racism. The husband said, oh, never mind about that gook. When my time, because I did not speak English like the native here, they could harass me, they could say bad thing about me. I cannot talk back to them. But I thought my children, they were born here.
Me and my brother, we actually went to a dentist. Another man came over and he walks into the counter and he says very loudly that he doesn't want to be in the same office with people like me and my brother. And he requested that we either leave the office and sit in our cars when we're waiting, or he's just going to make an appointment for a different day.
All minorities got to get together and do the right thing and speak the right, for the right thing.
I'll be back soon with 3 African Americans for a conversation on oppression and microaggressions.
Imagine being locked up for almost 40 years for a crime you did not commit. Wrongful convictions happen more often than you think, especially to Black and Hispanic men. Giovanna Boggins has this powerful story.
On November 23, 1967, Walter Lomax took his younger sisters, Audrey and Vivian Lomax, to a school dance. Lomax was attacked by a group of young men and severely beaten and stabbed in his right hand.
I was beat up pretty bad.
The knife went so deep that it fractured Lomax's hand and it had to be heavily bandaged.
They had to wrap it with layers of gauze until the swelling go down.
More than a week later, Lomax was told by a family member that the police were looking for him. A warrant had been issued for his arrest, but it was a mistake, and Lomax went to the police station to clear it up.
I went to the police station that morning. I thought I was be back home that evening.
But Walter wouldn't get home that evening. In fact, he wouldn't get home until 40 years later. The police accused him of a robbery and the killing of a shop owner.
The Baltimore City Police Department had literally framed me for the charges.
10 days before Lomax went to the police station, Robert Brewer was murdered in a holdup. The police accused Lomax, but he had an alibi.
The day that the crime that I was eventually convicted of, I was at Johns Hopkins Hospital getting the hand retreated.
And witnesses told police the gunman shot Brewer using his right hand, something that wouldn't have been possible because of Lomax's bandage. Despite these facts, Lomax was convicted of first-degree murder by an all-white jury. He was sentenced to life in prison. Audrey Lomax, one of the sisters that was with Lomax on the night he was attacked at the school dance, says she and her family were devastated.
We're very close, so a tragedy like that really, the whole family was hurting deep inside.
I had just turned 20 in 1967. When I was released, I had just turned 60.
During Lomax's time in prison, he held on to hope.
I don't know when and I don't know how, but I'm coming up out of here. I'm fighting to the death because I didn't do it, and I'm never going to acknowledge or admit that I did.
Walter's words turned into reality. In 2002, Centurion, an organization that investigates cases of wrongful convictions, committed to Lomax's case. In 2006, a judge vacated his sentence. He was put on unsupervised probation, but he was not yet exonerated.
It was truly a blessing to the whole family. That day in the courtroom, everybody just went crazy, just so excited that our brother is finally coming home to be with us.
Before ending Lomax's probation, Judge Gail Raisin ordered a psychiatric evaluation.
The psychiatrist found that he had no diagnosis whatsoever. He was not angry, he was not depressed. It was extraordinary, frankly, how well he had adjusted to being released.
In 2014, Lomax was exonerated. And after years of fighting for compensation, in 2019, Lomax was awarded $3 million. But he says money will not make up for his stolen time.
Once a person's had that experience, they will never, ever be the same. No amount of compensation will be able to change that.
Lomax became the executive director for the Maryland Restorative Justice Initiative, an organization to advocate and promote humane and sensible criminal justice and sentencing policies.
They say, if you could help somebody, your living won't be in vain. And ever since the day that he left the courtroom, he's been helping. He never gave up.
I was affected by that same system and by those same policies, to try to do something to make a difference.
A difference he says he makes by educating people about the system to bring about change and solutions. For Montclair News Lab, I'm Giovanna Boggins.
Jason Williams is a professor at Montclair State, an author, and an expert on Black Lives Matter. I recently sat down with him and asked him, how do you define justice?
What I try to teach my students is every side of that coin, all of the perspectives around what justice is, right? And then we look at the outcomes, and then they have to make a decision on what they think justice is. So it's not for me to tell them, really, it's for them to observe, to study what all of these perspectives are, and for them to come to a conclusion. One thing that I often argue is the need for consequences on the job. So if I mess up on my job, I know almost immediately that I will be terminated, right? And so these are the kind of corrective measures that we need to see for policing, and until that happens, until these, very immediate corrective measures are placed into the institution of policing, we might not see the kind of sea change that we need to see in policing, unfortunately.
Professor Williams says, police presence isn't always the same at every protest.
The police is the most salient, state representative, for many of us. We don't often see our mayors or our legislators, but we always see the police on any given day. I was involved in many of the protests or the aftermath of what happened last summer with Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so forth and so on. So I was present at many of those and certainly had witnessed the presence of the police at them. And I was at some of the Ferguson ones as well. So I recall, I have the pictures and the videos as well. What's so interesting about it is that whenever Black Lives Matter, right, plan something at the Capitol, the Guard is there, right? DC police, so they're typically ready for, Black protesters to march on the Capitol, but for some reason they weren't that day. And so I think that's why we need a full-scale investigation into the preparation and non-preparation of what happened in January, because there is a clear racial differential here.
How would you describe being a Black man in this country and having to speak for others?
As a member of the Black community, I take my positionality very seriously, meaning that both as a social scientist, but then also as a member of that community. There aren't enough Black professors, Black, criminologists, if you will, who can pose as that example even to students, right? You may have Black students, Black undergraduate students who are sitting in criminal justice classrooms who would otherwise be inspired to come into this field, but, they don't have enough people who look like them in front of those classrooms, unfortunately.
Williams goes on to say that he has hope for the future as young people continue their fight for criminal justice reform.
Since the death of George Floyd last May, American law enforcement has been under a microscope. But where do people of color who are also in law enforcement stand in this divide? Z.W. Gleason reports.
This was the scene in Montclair last year, one of many nationwide protests supporting Black Lives Matter. In the middle of this widespread reckoning are law enforcement officers of color. This is a story about 3 of them, each dealing with a complicated national history. Lieutenant Tyrone Williams has been with the Montclair Police Department for 22 years. He's seen a lot and says racism is a persistent problem.
I've been Black for 53 years. I've been a police officer for 22. There needs to be people that can speak to both sides and speak from both sides of the coin. I'm the one that's supposed to be able to bring us together and tear down and break down the walls, but also to be able to build a trust, a partnership, a collaboration between the two, because I can speak the language of both.
Lieutenant Williams says our police departments grew out of the American slave patrols of the 1700s and 1800s. After the Civil War, these patrols developed into police departments that monitored the behavior of newly freed slaves and enforced segregation policies. Lieutenant Williams believes police officers of color have a special responsibility.
There is institutional racism. It's still very prevalent in our society. It's very well rooted in law enforcement. Law enforcement didn't create racism in this country. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Law enforcement is a result of racism in this country.
Kenneth Moore retired after 27 years in the FBI. He says he wanted to be an agent since he was a child. As a college student, Moore had a run-in with law enforcement that almost changed his mind, but ultimately made him more resolute to become an agent. Moore says a police officer arrested him while he and friends were on the way to Pascal's, a famous Atlanta restaurant in the civil rights movement. The officers accused him of robbery. He says this was false.
It was very disappointing and absolutely disgusting to hear the officer under oath stand before the judge and lie and claim that we had approached him in a very threatening manner with our fists clenched. Luckily, the judge also gave me an opportunity to speak. Perhaps I was a little bit more persuasive than he was, and she dismissed the charges. But still, the experience of being arrested, appearing in court, and seeing a sworn law enforcement officer intentionally stand there and lie against 2 young African Americans who had never been arrested or had any issues with law enforcement before. I'll never forget that experience, or his name.
Moore's experience back then is common in minority communities. Many people of color don't trust members of law enforcement because of these encounters. Moore says change is difficult.
In order to effect change, you have to be intimately involved. Yes, you can pass legislation, enact different policies, etc. But someone has to be on the inside to ensure that that's being followed and that that change is occurring.
Cece Green wants to be an agent for the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. She says some people don't like that idea.
They'll be like, oh, so you're turning your back on us. I tried not to really bring it up in conversation. I did not want to feel like I was, betraying my race.
Green says beside the color of one's skin, gender can also be a point of discrimination.
Whether subconsciously or consciously, people are going to make assumptions based off of the fact that I'm a woman as well as a woman of color.
3 dedicated law enforcement officers.
I think that law enforcement agencies should strive to reflect the communities that they serve.
Grappling with what it's like to be Black and wear the blue.
We do need to look at our system as a whole and see what changes we can make to make it better for the citizens of this country.
For the sake of ourselves and our children.
I just want to make the world a better place for people that look like me.
For Montclair News Lab, I'm ZW Gleason.
Thanks, ZW. It's time now for our Second Generations Report. This time, Grace Rowland brings us 3 generations of African Americans.
The Black community has been fighting for equality since the birth of this country. I spoke with 3 African Americans about the racism they've dealt with their entire lives.
Naeem Rashid, a veteran born in 1949 who experienced segregation firsthand. Tanya Boggins, a mother of 4 born in 1969. Corey Annan, a Montclair State student born in the year 2000.
The Black Lives Matter movement sparked inspiration for change, but for the older generations, this feels familiar.
Since Black Lives Matter movement, I've seen, I'm glad the people are more conscious about what's going on in the Black community, first of all. And that injustice has been going on since I was a kid. I remember when the police came into our neighborhood to arrest a young man, and then they treated him so bad. And before I know it, it turned into a full-fledged riot in Philadelphia. And it was all about how the young man was being treated. And you fast forward to today, the same is still going on.
I felt the difference in my neighborhood. Like going in the stores, just felt a little bit different than prior.
I feel like people are becoming more socially aware of what they're saying and like conscious. Like I even had people from like 5th grade literally hitting me up and apologize for like the stuff they called me. It's nice to see the change happening. And I think while we need more change, we're on the right track.
Trump was a big problem as far as race in this country is concerned. He gave the racists a voice again. I see things now that I thought I'd never see again. But the situation is grave now, even much so as thinking about COVID. A lot of Blacks, older Blacks, are afraid to take the drug because of how they used us as guinea pigs back in the past. The first time I can remember experiencing racism is just walking down the street and have somebody drive by and call you the N-word. Other times, going downtown shopping, we just had to hold the clothes up against us because we're not allowed to go into dressing rooms.
Growing up predominantly in a Black community, I went to an all-Black school, but in middle school, I was, transported to majority white school. And that was the first time that I experienced racism because I wasn't really around any other race besides my own. Teachers were ignoring my questions, like not calling on me if I raised my hands. It's like a hidden thing, like you can feel the undercurrent of it, which you see on TV, which you heard. It made it seem like, okay, Caucasian people were a superior race than us.
Really, it started in 5th grade. And I was a very soft-spoken, just not like the typical Black person you see on television. So I was made fun of for my voice, made fun of for the way I talked, called me like Oreo. It kind of just started to resonate with me. Like, this isn't, just kids being kids. This is racism.
In the military, I ran across more racism than everyday life. And when I went up for promotions or whatever, race came into the issue. When I was at the Pentagon, part of the Navy News Service, I got a new senior chief in, and he came out and told me he didn't like Black people. When my son was born, I just told him to treat people the way you like to be treated. There's no need to walk around with a chip on your shoulder. But if someone addresses you in the wrong, appropriate way, you handle yourself.
I teach them, you don't stoop to a person's level by calling them names. And if they call you a name, if they call you the N-word, if they say something like that, say, no, I'm not, you are. You're the ignorant person because you're calling me outside my name. That's not who I am. And to make sure that they report it so it can stop.
If someone's calling you a racial slur, call him out, but don't throw names at him. Maybe and explain to him why, calling someone the N-word or saying the N-word in general is not appropriate, especially if you're not a person of color.
I'll be back for the final installment of Generations, where I speak to Muslim Americans about life after 9/11.
We have a lot more coming up on Focus Racial Justice.
First, we'll meet two recent Latina MSU graduates working at MSNBC.
Someday we are going to have enough representation of the Latinas.
Then, one sports team at Montclair State is making a difference with t-shirts.
I feel like that we need to keep bringing attention to the topic.
And later, we'll learn about the challenges and rewards of running a Black-owned brewery in New Jersey.
It was just really me and a bunch of guys saying, let's chase our dream.
But now, they were here first, Native Americans, and their story in this country is one of persecution and racial injustice. Here's a report from Joseph Giordano on a New Jersey tribe and their struggles.
Even though the Ramapo Lenape Nation of northern New Jersey tribe helped George Washington during the Revolution, the Lenape people faced harsh discrimination throughout the history of this country, and still do.
Right now, we're facing what we had faced 500 years ago. We're looking at people stealing our land. We're looking at a lot of fiscal manipulations. And we're looking at people that have little or no way to sustain themselves in this type of economy.
Chief Dwayne Perry, the elective chief of the Ramapo Lenape Nation, leads over 3,000 members in both New York and New Jersey. They have been trying to get federal recognition since 1993, which would mean control of their land. The tribe is clashing with local government over zoning, building, and land use. They say they need these things to survive as an indigenous nation.
I'm just saying, what is some of the major challenges today is simply the general public's lack of critical thinking. And what you find with my own people is we're at the end of what I tend to call a quiet genocide.
Relations are strained with the surrounding community of Mahwah Township. Kenneth Lumpkin is an anthropology professor at Montclair State teaching Native American history.
I mean, I remember when I was a kid, talking about them, that there was history about them, but there was also kind of a fear. So there is an injustice, a huge injustice right there. It just perpetuated the myth of these people as being bad and mean and all that. And they've always had that. The surrounding community, the Mahwah and Ringwood, had a very tense, kind of iffy relationship with them.
The Mahwah Township government cited the tribe for zoning violations, accusing them of constructing teepees and stone structures without approved permits. Mayor Bill LaFayette told the local newspaper, "We filed this action for zoning violations on this property as we would for any other resident violating our zoning laws. Mayor Bill LaFayette said, we're treating them exactly the same." But Chief Perry says they are not exactly the same. He and his people were here first.
The message would simply be, let's go back to square one. We are human beings. We are the people who made it possible for the American Revolution to be successful.
Besides land use issues, Native Americans here in New Jersey and across the nation face many of the obstacles other challenged groups face. Poverty, substance abuse, lack of health care, poor education, and other problems. The chief has a simple request.
All we are asking is that our homeland is be returned to us and we be left alone without the racism to be able to flourish economically and academically without all the burden upon our children.
The original residents of New Jersey, asking for justice and some of their land back. For Montclair News Lab, I'm Joseph Giordano.
I recently spoke with Brianna D'Agostino, a senior at Montclair State. She's a member of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Nation, and her native name is She Who Brings Joy.
In recent years, Native American groups in New Jersey have been fighting to regain their recognition after it was revoked by the Christie administration in 2015. The recognition was taken away in efforts to prevent these nations from building casinos that would compete with Atlantic City. After a lawsuit from the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribe, all nations were given back their state recognition. Now, the Ramapo Lenape Nation is fighting for federal recognition.
It's a simple act of recognition, just saying, we are living on the land of the first people of the Ramapo Nation. It's not that hard to do. So the fact that they're still fighting is very saddening, and it's very disheartening to Native Americans to think that, we came here, we were here peacefully, living here. They came over and took our land, and we still can't find common ground to be civil with each other.
Brianna explained how her understanding of the experiences her people were going through affected her outlook on the United States.
I have not felt safe in this country since I could really dictate what racism was and what injustice was, because Native Americans live with that every day as other minorities do.
What do you think the American government can do to help these people in these tribes and nations overcome this?
I feel like the US government should put more funding into domestic affairs instead of, external international affairs. You need to help the people in the United States first. And the people in the United States are suffering, not just Native Americans, but many people in, low income neighborhoods and societies. Our history system in the United States is very whitewashed. Our history books are made by Caucasian people, and they really do not go over the true history of Native Americans, of African Americans, of Latino Americans, Asian Americans. We're still going through a quiet genocide right now of people not knowing anything about us and not caring, but it starts at home and it starts with you, and you have to educate yourself first, and then we can start opening up these hard conversations that need to be talked about.
Brianna says that one of her goals while attending Montclair State was to create a Native American organization on campus, but her plans were halted due to the pandemic. Her goal is that the school creates a safe space for Indigenous students.
It's an issue in New Jersey and across the nation. History textbooks that leave out large parts of our history, everybody's history. We go into this controversy with NewsLab reporter Katie Cameron.
Gianna Glover is a graduating senior at South Plainfield High School. She remembers questioning how her school dealt with her race when she was only 10 years old. The assignment, draw the flag from where your family is from and write about that place.
So I just had to draw the American flag because my family really had no idea. Our ancestors were brought over here by mostly slavery. My teacher gave me a 0 and yelled at me, telling me that it's nonsense that I don't know where I'm from and that I need to redo the project.
Gianna's parents then sent a long email to her teacher, and the assignment was removed from the lesson plan.
It's really changed my perspective of what you learn in school and every other piece of Black history I really got to know from my family and my parents.
Landmark in television entertainment.
There's like this movie series called Roots.
The true story Alex Haley uncovered in his 12 years search across the 7 generations of his ancestry.
And it's infamous among Black people to like make your kids learn about slaves and where they're from. It wasn't until I got older where I really found out there's so much more beneath the surface than what they tell you.
It's called whitewashing. The telling of history through the white experience that minimizes or misrepresents that of non-white people. This problem still persists in New Jersey, even though the Amistad Law, named after the famous slave rebellion, was passed almost 20 years ago. The law requires African American history to be taught in all New Jersey schools.
So it really shouldn't be that difficult to teach a broader curriculum in New Jersey.
Professor Leslie Wilson teaches African and African American history studies at Montclair State.
New Jersey has a Holocaust law, it has an Amistad law, and it has an LGBTQ law. And so therefore, because these things are already on the books, these things should be taught in New Jersey schools.
The other issue, American history textbooks.
I've been suspicious of textbooks, not so much what they're teaching that's incorrect, but what they're leaving out and what's been missing.
Stacy Schiller teaches American history and Holocaust studies at a predominantly white public high school in Monmouth County.
I think that a lot of teachers struggle with becoming anti-racist educators for lots of reasons, because of implicit or unconscious bias in the treatment of students of color, because of discomfort in discussing race. White teachers have a hard time acknowledging their own racial identity because as white folks, we're not taught we have a race and that race has meaning.
According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, roughly 75% of school administrators and 80% of K-12 teachers are white, while at least 42% of students in America were people of color in 2017.
A lot of teachers will stick to what is in a book as opposed to venturing beyond the book or enhancing the material in the book. And a good teacher, particularly a good history teacher, has to go beyond the textbook to help their students understand any type of issue that exists in history. And so if you're only going to stick to the book, you're not going to give the students the rich type of history that they deserve.
Pearson, McGraw-Hill, and Houghton Mifflin Harcourt make up 85% of all K-12 textbooks. These three publishers dominate the textbook market, but what students read depends on what edition they receive, and reviews are made by their own state or district to suit policymakers. The content has glaring differences on African American culture on society. One example is the story of just who came on those first ships to the New World, says Professor Wilson.
Columbus uses Africans to travel across the ocean. And what I use this to demonstrate to my students is that the first people who end up in the New World as Africans are not enslaved people, but are free people. That they all do not come as enslaved people. They come as explorers and discoverers, and they transform the Americas because they play a critical role in the opening up of this new world.
Gianna says a majority of important aspects of Black history, like the origin of cornrows, she learned from her family, not from textbooks.
You know, Black girls that get their hair braided a lot, they would braid each other's hair, but hide messages within the hair. So it was kind of like a code because they couldn't all talk to each other about a message they want to relay.
Gianna dreams of going to college to study nursing. She recently received the Amistad Commission's Rising Scholarship Recognition Award, which recognizes students' high achievements in academics and leadership.
I always think about the kids who are subject to this and have nothing to help them.
Gianna has only one thing to say to educators.
You're a history teacher, you should like history, and knowing history also means knowing everybody's history.
History is the way we tell our stories, to use the past to enlighten the present. And whose stories we tell relies on properly trained educators and the books they use. For Montclair News Lab, this is Katie Cameron.
We now look at launching your career in the media and communication field as a person of color. I'm so excited that I was able to have the opportunity to talk to Carly Henriquez and Shayla Baez, two Latina graduates, both working now at MSNBC. I asked them, when did they know that they wanted to pursue a career in the media?
I love just approaching anybody on campus and saying, what are your thoughts on this latest current events? I felt like I was a part of the community and telling a story beyond that. So that's where I fell in love with journalism and the media industry as a whole.
I didn't know people went to school for this because in the Latino community, that's not something that's spoken about. So when I transferred from nursing to communications, I didn't even know what I was getting myself into, but I did know I was always curious, always asking questions. And I realized that these are skills that will, get you a long way in this field.
How did your family respond to the both of you wanting to go into the media industry?
When I switched my majors and transferred into Montclair State, I didn't even tell my mom in the beginning because I was so scared. And the other problem was I didn't even know how to explain it to her. Well, I'm going to switch from nursing. My next career is kind of I ask questions. And then when you tell them, oh, journalism, they think, oh, so you're going to be on camera. My mom knows nothing about that. She turns on Univision and she thinks it's just anchors and cameras. People don't know about the behind the scenes. There's producers, there's writers, and people that were even born here don't know that.
Well, my mom was very skeptical at first. She's like, are you even going to find any jobs out there that will feed you? So she was very hesitant because I was an information technology major prior to being a comms and media major. And she just was like, I'm not really sure. You would have to explain it more to me. And even myself, it was kind of difficult explaining it to her in Spanish. There's so many different roles behind the scene. So there was definitely not a full support because it was just so unknown to them.
What does it mean to be a first generation graduate?
Oh God, it means you're breaking generational chains. My parents have not graduated from high school even. I already broke one chain when I graduated from high school and I received my diploma. And then I also became the first one to obtain a bachelor's degree. So it feels really good because I know that I can finally help out more financially. So I'm really grateful and I did it for them.
For me, it means everything because I was raised by a single mother She has always worked factory jobs. And I remember when I was younger, we had like, they gave you like a school supply list. And I remember having to tell my teachers like, oh, can you give me until like a few more weeks because my mom can't afford to buy school supplies.
How do you feel on how just Latinas are represented in the media?
I know particularly in films, we're still not represented as we should. We're still like the sexy mommy. And it is very harmful to our images because we're not taken seriously. We're really capable of doing more. And I know that there are many people like myself, like Shayla, who are trying to just break those stereotypes and say, we can be executive producers, we can be reporters.
I think the news portrays immigrants as they're drug dealers, they come to steal, like we're seen as like the bad people. And that's not true. Like a lot of immigrants do the jobs that the people here don't want to do. We get paid less.
Hopefully in the future, someday, we are going to have enough representation of the Latinas in the media field where we don't have to prove ourselves anymore. So starting to inform your own community and bring whatever information you have and resources back, that's what matters. You know, that's the end goal for me, at least.
Carly and Shayla, two young Latina journalists pursuing their dreams.
Grace Rowland is back with another generation segment, this time with Muslim Americans.
After 9/11, many Americans were left in a state of shock and fear, while Muslim Americans faced discrimination for their own religion and heritage. I spoke to 3 Muslim Americans about the discrimination they faced in their own country.
Shpreza Kenka. Born in 1954, she grew up in Macedonia and is a grandmother of 9. Because she doesn't speak English, you'll hear the voice of a translator over her Albanian. Iman Hussein, a professor of Arabic born in 1979. Amir Al-Salman. Born in 1995, he's currently a director at the United States United Arab Emirates Business Council.
Probably from between the 2nd grade to the 8th grade, which was when I left the US, I probably on a daily or at least minimum on a weekly basis, I would have people call me Bin Laden, call me terrorist, tell me to blow myself up, and much more like horrible things. And it got to the point where it wasn't just students. I had like the football coach of the team in front of the entire team, in front of the fans. Instead of like calling my number or my name to go on the field, he'd call me Bin Laden, get on the field.
I came to America in 2006. I felt that, you know, the people, they don't want to talk to me. They take their kids away. I did feel back then that was something to deal with my nationality or my race and my background.
After 9/11,
the FBI and police would go to a lot of the mosques in the north and record the people praying there and question them for suspicious activity just because they were Muslim. My son was really religious as well, and he experienced the police recording him and observing him while he was praying. We would get looks of judgment more often.
Even in these supercharged times since the election of Donald Trump and this past hectic year, I don't think I've experienced anything to the extent of which I did when I was younger here.
I work at college and people are welcoming and accepting. In the area where I live also is have diversity of people, and you know, they accept each other and they are good with each other.
I taught my children to follow the faith, no matter what anyone says. And if you're ever faced with any discrimination, just kill them with kindness and move on. There is no reason to go back and forth. Being Muslim teaches you not to lie, not to steal. It has a lot of good fundamental reasons. I taught them not to confuse that with any perception society puts on them.
Even if you experience something like that, you just should report it and do not do anything against it, because if you do, and then you are doing the same action like the person who did the discrimination to you.
First of all, I think right now society as a whole is getting more accepting of, you know, different races, different backgrounds, religions, things like that. So I think from that aspect, hopefully they won't have to deal with a lot of what I or my generation went through. But from a personal aspect, it starts from, you know, from their very first memories that you need to tell them that just because someone's color of skin is different than yours does not make them a different person. Just because, you know, you happen to be born Christian does not make Christianity better than Judaism. And just because you're a Muslim does not make you superior to a Hindu.
America doesn't have one set religion. It's amazing for Christians, Jewish people, Muslims. I just hope it stays as it is, like a melting pot.
Racism, xenophobia, discrimination, no matter when you were born, these things are happening. Today, yesterday, 50 years ago. It's time for a change we would all love to see. For Focus Racial Justice, I'm Grace Rowland.
Athletes across the nation have shown their support for racial justice. Corey Annan of the Red Hawk Sports Network shows us an example right here at Montclair State.
If you watched the Montclair State men's basketball team this season, you probably saw the Red Hawks wear some new t-shirts during their pregame drills. The idea for the shirts was inspired by Devin Cooper as a way to speak out against racial injustice.
I really got into the racial injustice topic back when the George Floyd incident started. You know, I was a part of a few marches, if you will, for the Black Lives Matter movement. And I really thought, like, now it was season time, you know, like, what could I do to, like, bring awareness to this topic without honestly, like, trying to step on anybody's toes for the most part.
Devin reached out to his father, James Cooper, for some help. James creates merchandise for Hoop Group, a basketball company dedicated to helping young basketball players reach the next level. To support his son and his cause, James printed the shirts for the entire team at no cost. As for the design, the team opted not to use the words Black Lives Matter on their shirts. Instead, the words black and white are crossed out with the word human in bold. The purpose behind this was to remind people that regardless of skin color, everyone is human.
It was really bringing, like I said before, bringing attention to the fact that there are racial injustices going on in this country, and that we're trying our best to at least bring attention to this topic.
The players themselves weren't the only ones to get on board with the t-shirts, as head coach Justin Potts encourages his players to use their platforms for change and always keeps his players aware of what's going on in the world.
What they were putting on, and I thought it was a great message to send, and you know, we supported it wholeheartedly, and I think it was good for our program. We have a very diverse team. You know, and I think as I try to tell the guys all the time, they have a platform that not everybody has, you know, and when you're playing a sport, especially in a pandemic where there were limited activities happening, you know, we were going to get, you know, 2 games a week that were going to be, you know, put on YouTube and zoomed out there and all that kind of stuff. So it was a way to you know, show that the solidarity that we had as a program, and then also hopefully shed some light on some things we felt needed to change in the world.
The debut of the t-shirts came during the team's season opener on February 5th against William Patterson. The moment was a special one for everyone involved, especially Devin Cooper, who believes that the t-shirts go way beyond basketball.
I felt, and I'm pretty sure the rest of my teammates felt, extremely accomplished and proud. One, just to be able to wear the t-shirts, because, you know, like, asking people, like, our coach was extremely understanding about it, and he had our back 100%, and that's extremely important too. I don't really see any other NJAC schools like have the opportunity or do what we did with the shirts. So it was just like we stood out in that sense, and it was something like a lot more bigger than just the shirts.
Despite rising support for athletes speaking out against racial inequality, critics have maintained that athletes should stay out of politics and focus on their own sports.
If you're just doing like the shut up and dribble rule that one of the news anchors told LeBron James, then you're part of the problem too. And then in a way, we'd be a part of the problem too, because our silence isn't helping anyone. So the more we speak out, the more people get informed, and the more minds we could change.
While protests for the Black Lives Matter movement have slowed down in recent months, Cooper hopes that fans of the team are reminded that the fight for racial justice is still going on.
There'll be a rush of like a rush of something, and people and it's a really hot topic, and then that topic slowly dies down. And I feel like, not that it's dying down, but I feel like we're not giving it the same amount of attention that we did back when there was like really big incidents going on. Like, stuff is still going on in this world that is extremely messed up, and I feel like that we need to keep bringing attention to the topic, or else nothing will be done about it.
From the Red Hawk Sports Network,
I'm Corey Annan.
It's always hard to try to open up a small business, especially if you're a person of color trying to get a small business loan. Kevin Doyle has a story about persistence and craft beer.
Kick back and relax with a cold beer at Hackensack Brewing Company. Known for its wide selection of craft beers and for being one of the few black-owned breweries in New Jersey. In fact, according to a survey done by the Brewers Association, 88% of brewery owners in the U.S. are white, while just 1% are black.
It's definitely a fear of being first, right? I'm sure the first guy that walked on the moon didn't think he could do it until he put his foot down. That was a feeling that I think I had the day that the four of us sat down and signed the paperwork.
Herbert Barr and Mike Jones are the two main operators of Hackensack Brewing Company, which opened in 2019. The intention was to share their love for beer and good music with their hometown.
It's a melting pot of everybody right now. And I think when you look around our tap room, it represents the neighborhood.
Barr understands the struggle that many minorities face when opening a new business. Manveer Mann is a professor at the Feliciano School of Business at Montclair State.
It is very difficult for minorities and people of color to get access to capital for various reasons. They might not have a credit score, or they might have lower credit score than their white counterpart.
I don't know many black people that have the resources to open a brewery, right? That's a question mark. It's not a fixed price. And I think that's a deterrent, not knowing where you can pull these funds together.
Craft beer requires high-quality ingredients and more labor, and is produced in smaller batches.
Craft beer is, first of all, at least 2 to 3 times more expensive than regular beer. And then, we know that there's the big wealth gap between people of color and white. So really, it's who can afford it.
Marketing also plays a role, because craft beer has traditionally targeted young white males, and malt liquor targeted people of color.
Late 60s, these big brewing executives were sort of marketing mainly malt liquors to people of color. You could see ads in sort of magazines like The Jet, and then also some of the sort of celebrities, like they got Snoop Dogg to sort of talk about malt liquor, and also kind of incorporate that into songs.
Hackensack Brewing Company customers walk into an industrial-style tap room decked out in string lights and local music memorabilia. Partner Mike Jones is not only a brewer, but also a jazz and blues expert.
This is legendary stuff. I mean, these guys are absolute heavyweights in jazz. And actually, one of our main beers, our Moment's Notice, the name of that song is an homage to a track of the same name that was on Coltrane's Blue Train album.
And one of their most famous brews is called Parking Lot Pills.
Just a clean, easy drinking beer. And the name is kind of a reference and an ode to the tailgating culture that we grew up in this area. We wanted to make a beer that you could crush in a parking lot before a game or before a concert.
Craft beer organizations are starting to offer educational programs like internships and apprenticeships to focus on diversity.
You look around a brewery, you see everything. You see black, white, you see male, female, different sexual orientations. There is no stop at the door now because of breweries like this.
The story behind Hackensack Brewing Company shows that craft beer is for everyone. Lifelong friendship, a dream, and a love for beer made it happen. From Montclair News Lab, I'm Kevin Doyle.
Racial justice is something that we must keep having conversations about. I'm Bernice Stegwa.
And I'm Nicole Zarillo. We hope you learned a lot today and continue to discuss this topic even when it becomes uncomfortable. Thank you for joining us.
Focus Racial Justice is a collaboration of all the student media at Montclair State. Take a look at news stories, opinion pieces, and a mini documentary at the Montclarian. Hear interviews and discussions on WMSC 90.3 FM. Go to Red Hawk Sports Network for stories on the intersection of sports and racial justice. And Montclair News Lab will have more stories, weekly reports, and behind the scenes of this broadcast.